A locked gate that someone forgot to close. A train journey that should never have been allowed to happen. A driver who took the wrong turn at exactly the wrong moment. Three mistakes so small that none of the people involved thought twice about them. Three mistakes that between them produced the fall of a 1,000-year empire, the birth of the Soviet Union, and the chain reaction that killed over 100 million people in the 20th century. We look back at history and treat it like a finished story, like the outcomes were written in advance, like the Roman Empire had to fall, like the Great Wars had to happen, like the empires and disasters and turning points were the product of forces too enormous for any individual to have changed. This video is about those moments, the locked gates and wrong turns and forgotten orders that sit beneath the history you were taught in school. The moments that were never supposed to matter, the moments that changed everything. And the further we go, the smaller the details get, and the larger the consequences become. Let's begin in 1241. With the story of how Western Europe almost ceased to exist as a recognizable civilization, and the reason it survived has nothing to do with courage, strategy, or military genius. It has to do with a drinking problem. By the winter of 1241, the Mongol army under Batu Khan and the military genius Subutai had done something that should have been impossible. In a matter of months, they had swept through Poland and Hungary simultaneously on two separate fronts, hundreds of miles apart, destroying every army Europe sent against them. The Duke of Silesia tried to stop them at the Battle of Legnica. His army was annihilated. The Hungarian king tried at the Battle of Mohi, completely routed. Vienna was undefended, Germany was undefended, France was undefended. European rulers were writing desperate letters to each other. The Pope called for a crusade. Nobody came, because there was nothing left to come with. The Mongols had defeated everything the most powerful continent on Earth could field, and they were still moving west. And then, with Western Europe completely open in front of them, they stopped. They turned around, packed their camps, and rode east. For centuries, historians assumed this was strategic, that Subutai, perhaps the greatest military commander who ever lived, had simply decided Europe was not worth the effort. But the real reason is far stranger and far more fragile than that. The great Khan Ogadai, back in Mongolia, had died. Suddenly, unexpectedly, most likely from the consequences of decades of extraordinarily heavy drinking, and Mongol law required every senior commander to return to Mongolia to choose the next Khan. Subutai did not want to leave. By every account, he believed Europe was his to take. He was almost certainly right, but the law was absolute. Ogadai Khan drank himself to death on a specific night in December 1241, and that specific night is the reason Notre Dame Cathedral still stands. It is the reason the Louvre exists. It is the reason the entire cultural and intellectual tradition of Western Europe was never absorbed into the largest land empire in human history. One man's liver. That is the foundation that Western civilization was unknowingly built on. And if that seems like the strangest thing on this list, we are nowhere near finished. Let's go to Constantinople. May 29th, 1453. Because the greatest city in the Western world, the capital of an empire that had existed continuously for over 1,000 years, as the direct successor of Rome fell on that morning, and it did not fall because of superior military force. It did not fall because of strategic brilliance. It fell because of a gate. Constantinople's walls were considered the most formidable defensive fortification in the known world. They had held for over 1,000 years. When the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II arrived with his massive army and his legendary basilica cannon, so enormous it required 60 oxen to move it, and could only be fired 7 times per day, the Byzantine defenders still believed the walls would hold. For 53 days they held. The Ottomans bombarded the walls continuously, launched assault after assault, and were repelled every single time. By early May, Mehmed was reportedly considering abandoning the siege entirely. His advisors were urging him to withdraw. The city had survived everything thrown at it. And then, someone forgot to lock a gate. The gate was called the Kirko Porta, a small postern gate in the wall, used for quick military sorties. It had been left unlocked after a Byzantine raiding party returned through it in the darkness. A group of Ottoman soldiers probing the walls found it standing open. They pushed through, and they were inside the walls before anyone realized what had happened. In the chaos that followed, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI charged directly into the fighting and was never seen again. The city fell within hours. 53 days of the most powerful artillery in the medieval world could not do it. One unlocked gate did. The fall of Constantinople ended the Byzantine Empire permanently. It reshaped the entire political geography of Europe and the Middle East for centuries. It drove the final remnants of Greek scholarship westward into Italy, directly fueling the Renaissance. It is considered by many historians to be the moment that ended the Middle Ages and began the modern era. All of it because someone did not lock a gate. Now let's move west to 1588, because the story of how the Spanish Armada almost erased the English-speaking world begins not with cannon fire or Atlantic storms, but with something even smaller: shallow water. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 men, the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Atlantic Ocean, set sail to invade England, overthrow Queen Elizabeth I, and end the Protestant Reformation by force. Spain was the most powerful empire on earth. England was a relatively small island nation that had been growing increasingly bold above its weight. On paper, this should have been straightforward. The Spanish plan depended entirely on linking up with a large veteran army in the Spanish Netherlands under the Duke of Parma, approximately 17,000 of the most battle-hardened soldiers in the world. If that army boarded the Armada successfully, the combined invasion force would have been essentially impossible for England to repel. The English navy, skilled and courageous as it was, could not have stopped a landing of 17,000 experienced Spanish soldiers, backed by 130 warships. But Parma's flat-bottomed transport barges could not get out of the shallow coastal harbor waters. A fleet of small, fast Dutch flyboats was blockading the exit. The barges had no answer for the flyboats. They could not fight their way out of the shallows. The army never boarded, and without the army, the Armada was just ships that got scattered by English fire ships in the Channel, battered by weather, and sent on a disastrous journey around Scotland and Ireland trying to get home. Of the 130 ships that had set out in triumph, fewer than 67 returned. No successful Armada means no British Empire. No British Empire means no American colonies. No American colonies means no United States of America. No United States means the entire shape of the modern world. Its languages, its politics, its dominant culture is unrecognizable to us today. The English-speaking world exists because of shallow water and small boats in a Dutch harbor. Let's go to 1812. Because the story of how Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia destroyed the greatest army Europe had ever assembled begins not with the decision to invade, but with a decision made 5 weeks into the occupation of Moscow that almost nobody talks about. Napoleon had gathered the Grande Armée, nearly 500,000 soldiers from across Europe, the largest force the continent had ever seen, and invaded Russia in June, expecting a quick, decisive engagement. Russia would fight, lose, and negotiate. It had worked everywhere else. But Russia did not cooperate. Russia retreated. And as it retreated, it burned everything behind it. Crops, villages, supply depots, anything the French army might use to feed itself. Napoleon entered Moscow in September, expecting Russian surrender. Moscow was empty and on fire. He waited for a peace offer that never came. 1 week, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alexander I had already decided he would rather burn his own capital than negotiate. And every week Napoleon waited was another week his army consumed its remaining supplies, and the Russian winter moved closer. When he finally retreated in mid-October, the cold was already arriving. Of the nearly 500,000 soldiers who had marched into Russia full of confidence, fewer than 120,000 came out. Military historians have calculated that if Napoleon had begun his retreat just 3 weeks earlier, his army would have cleared the worst terrain before the deepest cold hit. 3 weeks. That is the margin between a catastrophic defeat and the total destruction of the greatest army Europe had ever seen. He was so certain Russia would negotiate that he could not accept the evidence that it would not. And that certainty cost him everything. Now let's go to the 20th century, because this next story involves a train journey that the German government arranged for reasons of cold strategic calculation, a journey that no one at the time fully understood the consequences of, and a passenger whose arrival at a single train station in Petrograd in April 1917 changed the entire direction of the century. Vladimir Lenin was living in exile in Switzerland when news reached him that the Tsar had abdicated and a provisional government had taken power in Russia. Lenin wanted to get back to Russia immediately, but Switzerland was landlocked and surrounded by warring nations. Britain and France controlled the sea routes and had every reason to keep the revolutionary leader out of Russia, where he might destabilize the new government that was committed to continuing the war against Germany. The German government saw the situation differently. A Russian revolution meant Russia leaving the war. Russia leaving the war freed somewhere between 1 million and 1.5 million German soldiers for the Western Front. Getting Lenin into Russia was therefore a German strategic priority of the highest order. So, Germany did something extraordinary. They arranged for Lenin and a group of Bolshevik colleagues to travel across Germany in a sealed train car, sealed officially, so that the revolutionary contamination inside could not infect Germany and into Russia through Sweden and Finland. Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd in April 1917. 7 months later, the Bolsheviks had taken power. Russia left the war. The Soviet Union was born, and the ideological conflict between Soviet communism and Western capitalism went on to define the next 70 years of human history. Every proxy war, every arms race, every political crisis from the Berlin airlift to the Cuban Missile Crisis to the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of it flows from the decision of German military planners to put one man on one train. If Germany had not made that decision, if Lenin had been stuck in Switzerland for another 6 months, the Bolsheviks almost certainly would not have taken power in October. The Soviet Union most likely never exists, and the entire geopolitical architecture of the 20th century, everything from the Korean War to Vietnam to the space race to the nuclear arms race, does not happen in the way it happened. One train journey, arranged by people trying to win a war they ultimately lost anyway. That is what produced the Soviet Union. And now, the smallest detail on this entire list. The one that sounds the most trivial. The one that may have had the largest consequences of all. June 28, 1914. Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was visiting the city. A group of Serbian nationalist assassins had positioned themselves along his motorcade route, carrying bombs and pistols. The first attempt failed completely. A bomb thrown at the Archduke's car bounced off the folded roof and exploded under the wrong vehicle. Several bystanders were wounded. Ferdinand survived. The assassins scattered into the crowd. After visiting the injured victims in the hospital, Ferdinand's motorcade changed its route for safety. The lead driver, a man named Leopold Loika, was not told about the route change. He turned onto the original street, Franz Joseph Street. Ferdinand's aide shouted that this was wrong. Loika braked and began to reverse. The engine stalled. The car sat motionless on Franz Joseph Street, long enough for a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip, who had given up after the failed bomb attack and wandered into a nearby delicatessen to get something to eat, to walk out of that delicatessen and find himself standing approximately 5 feet from the stationary open car containing the man he had come to kill. He raised his pistol. He fired twice. Within 6 weeks, Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia. France was pulled in by alliance. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain declared war because of Belgium. The mechanism that produced World War I, the Russian Revolution, the rise of Hitler, World War II, the Holocaust, and the Cold War clicked into motion in the time it takes to restart a car. Leopold Loika, the driver. He appears in almost no history books. He gave almost no interviews. He died in 1926, largely unknown, 12 years after the morning. His stalled engine changed the world. There is a reasonable argument that he is the most consequential person of the 20th century. Not because of what he did, because of what he accidentally failed to do at the exact worst possible moment. And that is the point. That is the thing that every story on this list is actually about. We look at history, and we see empires and battles and great leaders making decisive choices. We see the inevitable march of events that produce the world we live in. But underneath all of it, underneath every empire and every war and every civilization that rose or fell there, is a layer of tiny moments that nobody planned, nobody intended, and nobody understood at the time. A Khan who could not stop drinking. A soldier who did not lock a gate. Shallow water in a Dutch harbor. 5 weeks of waiting in a burning city. A train that should never have been allowed to run. A driver who took the wrong turn. The world did not have to turn out this way. The borders on your map, the language you are listening to right now, the country you live in, the political system that governs your life, all of it is downstream of moments exactly like these. Moments so small that the people involved did not realize what they were doing. Moments that history then buried under the weight of everything that came after, making the outcomes look inevitable when they were anything but. Civilization is not a monument. It is not solid or permanent or the inevitable product of great forces. It is a sequence of near misses, accidents, and ordinary human failures held together by consequences that nobody saw coming. It almost went differently, every single time. And the only reason you are here, in this world, speaking this language, living in these borders, is because on each of those days, in each of those moments, the smallest possible thing happened to fall the right way. Think about that the next time someone tells you history was inevitable. It wasn't. It almost wasn't this at all.